Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Gavin mentioned, my name's Steph, and it's a privilege to join with you today, and in particular, be part of the presentation of the Oliver Barclay Lectureship Award. Now, each year, if you're not aware of it, we have this, Christians in Science sponsor this lectureship in memory of Oliver Barclay, and he was particularly keen on encouraging and empowering effective new communicators to the conversation on science and faith. And this competition is run every year. We had a number of applicants to it this year. We have a number every year. And I'm delighted to have our president, Bob White, on stage to present and formally announce that the award this year goes to Zachary Ardern. Would you like to join us on stage? Jack's going to take a photo.
Okay, we got 3 photos.
Thank you.
Well done.
That's better. Actually, give a round of applause.
Now, Zach's going to be presenting to us in a moment, but I was particularly excited to hear that he had won this award. I heard him speak a couple of years ago. I don't know if he knows I was there in the audience, online audience, as it were, and he spoke at the European Leadership Forum. That was the first time I heard him speak, and I was particularly impressed with how you handled the panel. I think it was quite dynamic, lots of very diverse views on the panel, all scientists, and you really held your own, so I was really excited that you have been awarded it and will be speaking today. So over to you.
Okay, well, it's a great privilege to be here. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, which is a large institute just south of Cambridge, which has a particular focus on genomics. My research, we'll hear about shortly, is particularly in bacterial evolutionary genomics. And I'm also really interested in some of these broad questions about evolution. There's a lot of different life forms on Earth. Some of them we see up here. On the top left, we see the embryo of an anemone, a sea creature. On the top right, we see the tips of some growing algae. We see a spider. We see the hand of a gecko. And all these things and so many more might cause us to wonder, how did these get here? How does this evolutionary process which occurs around us, how does this actually work? And why is it that evolution is so fruitful in producing the amazing diversity of life? These photos are from a competition which is held every year. This is from this year's competition, hosted at nikonsmallworld.com. They have lots of these amazing microscopy pictures. This is the short version of what I'd like to discuss with you today. Firstly, that evolution is an interplay between these two big kinds of forces, contingent forces and law-like processes. And I want to argue, maybe controversially today, that both of these kinds of processes can be pointers to God's creative purpose. And lastly, that I think a helpful framework for seeing how this could be true and how this is the case is the framework of fine-tuning. I'd like to particularly thank a number of people who have influenced me, both alive currently and from the past. My friend Rope Kuyonen has written a really important book that I'll mention later. David Glass, who hopefully many of you may be familiar with, has done some really interesting work in this area. And back in the 1800s, Asa Gray and William Whewell also said some really useful things that I think have been sadly neglected and are worth picking up again. So another of these microscopy images, this one collated a series of steps in the development of an organism, in this case a clownfish. And I think most people, when they see this series of images, will see purpose, they'll see development, they'll see some kind of goal-oriented process. Hopefully that is not too controversial. This is development. It is heading towards the goal of the adult organism. But what about when we see this series of pictures, which I'll show soon, which is the history of our universe, which started with the Big Bang, and then has gone through various stages, including, among other things, these that we see on the screen. The development of galaxies, maybe a few 100 million years after the Big Bang. The development of the Earth-Moon system, the development of complex life, the first life, the development of complex animal life, the human brain. Maybe we could see this series of images as similarly purposeful or even perhaps goal-oriented in some way. There is definitely a process of development that's happening here, increasing complexity. And so one of the questions is, could it be okay to see this kind of development of the complexity in the universe over time is also a series of development? It's worth noting that this whole concept of historical processes that we tend to take for granted is maybe itself actually a biblical concept. So we in the Western world take this linear flow of history and historical development for granted as if it were self-evident, but they're not self-evident. Most cultures throughout the world at different time points have believed in either a steady state or the universe in cyclical repeats. Everything is going in cycles. It may seem to change, but that's just a short-term phenomenon. Ultimately, it comes back again in a cycle. And we see these in modern cosmological models, and we see these in various worldviews. And it's been argued in this excellent book by the leading historian of geology, Professor Martin Rudwick, that the strong sense of history, which the Judeo-Christian tradition had, has an underlying structure that is closely analogous to the modern view of the Earth's deep history as similarly finite and directional. So this idea that we take for granted that the Earth itself has a history which is linear, it had a particular starting point and it's progressing in some way over time. In some sense, the foundation of modern geology actually comes from or is influenced by a Judeo-Christian worldview. So that's surprising. It's one of the kind of core features of deep history, which has been so controversial for Christians, has actually been influenced by a Judeo-Christian view of the world. Now on to the main question, the first question, how does evolution work? And then later, why does it work? So my own research is very much focused on the how of evolution works. And this is one of the nicest illustrations of it that I'm aware of, and maybe you've come across it as well. This is called a mega plate, as we see up here. Mega is an acronym for Microbial Evolutionary Growth Arena. And this illustration shows the result of a few days of evolution. So this was a large Petri dish the size of a large table, and on each side of the Petri dish there were bacteria placed. And towards the center of the dish, in increasing concentrations, were antibiotics. So initially the bacteria couldn't grow apart from the very edges of the dish. But over the course of a couple of days, the bacteria changed genetically such that they were able to grow. They evolved before our eyes. You can find online a sped-up movie of this. And so this was evolution in action before our eyes. And what we see with these colored drawings is we can actually trace the evolutionary history. We can go and sequence the DNA of the bacteria at the different time points and see which genetic changes occurred. So this is a great illustration of the kinds of things that I research at the moment at a larger scale of the molecular view of evolution. And these are really complex processes. It might seem, in some ways it's simple, it's just mutation and selection, but there's all kinds of complex molecular processes involved in each of these, in causing the mutations, in biasing them in particular ways, in sifting them through various different kinds of selection, and in recombining these variants to create the long-term phenomenon of evolution. Of course, it's not just in the lab that we can see evolution. Over the last couple of years, we've seen evolution before our eyes in a different way with the COVID-19 pandemic caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And I've done a little bit of research on this myself, and this is a nice illustration of the different variants that have accumulated over the last couple of years. So evolution really does happen before our eyes. We can control it in the lab, and we can see it over the course of a few years in various biological entities or organisms, including viruses. And if you're interested in the details of my research, you can check out my website. So there's the molecular detail of evolution, but then behind that, there's the kind of more abstract kinds of processes that are involved. And there's two, I would say, there's two main categories of processes. There's contingent processes and law-like processes. So on the left, to illustrate contingent processes, I've got paths diverging in a wood to illustrate the historical contingency that historically some processes could have gone one way or they could have gone the other way. And there's nothing particularly inherent in the process that tells us it was definitely going to go one way or the other. So there's a lot of historical contingency in evolution. But then there's also law-like processes. The falling apples, a reference to Newton's falling apple in gravity. There are also regularities in evolution, things like natural selection and other things. So evolution is this interplay of the contingent processes and the law-like processes. And we could, go into a lot of depth on each of these. Within contingent processes, we have things like genetic drift, or transposable elements that seem to insert randomly in genomes or semi-randomly in some sense. There's all kinds of extremely rare events, and I'll mention one of these later in evolution. There's catastrophic environmental shifts that aren't inherently predictable. So there's all kinds of contingent historical processes, but then on the other hand, there's also law-like processes, things which are more regular or predictable. Things like natural selection, which Darwin conceived of as some kind of law, evolutionary convergence, as you've likely heard about from people like Simon Conway Morris. There's interesting biases in the relationship between possible sequences of, say, DNA and the structures that they create, such as protein structures. And Ard Louis, a Christian professor at Oxford, is one of the leaders in this field, and maybe you've heard one of his talks before. And then on the environmental side, there's not only historically contingent events, but there's also evolution in the history of the Earth, which is in some sense regular. So there are trends in planetary evolution which are in some sense predictable, regular, can be modeled with known processes. So evolution is this mix of contingent historical processes and law-like processes, and often people emphasize one or the other, but they're both important. And one of the suggestions I'd like to make is that maybe we can think about this as, rather than these really abstract theoretical terms of contingent and law-like, we could see it as a mix of creativity and order. And I'll try and explain this a little bit. So related to these terms of contingency and law is another dichotomy, which is quite famous, of chance and necessity. And people may think that whether you're talking about chance and necessity or contingency and law, these are atheistic concepts. They're impersonal. And they were used this way explicitly by people like Jacques Monod, the famous French molecular geneticist who was a strong materialist and saw these things as part of his worldview. So chance implies an undirected chaos, and necessity implies that there's no logical alternative, that whatever these necessary things are, they had to be that way, they're fixed that way as a matter of logic. There's no other way they could be. But I want to push back against both of these and say, just because an event is contingent doesn't mean it was true. It doesn't mean it was true chaos or unintended. So contingent events could be intended, and natural law is not just impersonal necessity. but could actually be the regular actions of God in the world. And this is the way that the early founders of modern science conceived of natural law, not as impersonal logical necessity, but as God's law-like action in the world. So instead, it might be more helpful to see both natural chance and natural necessity are both aspects of creation. So I think there's a useful theological framework for thinking about chance and necessity as instead something like creativity and order. And maybe these things could even more controversially, point to God in some sense. But if that was the case, how could that be so? A couple of quick examples. So how could chance, a chance event or a contingent event in history, point to God's creative action? Well, one example is that a landslide that occurred in the middle of the Jordan River. So chance events in natural history can appear to be pointers to God's providence over or within nature. Joshua, the book of Joshua, chapter 3, recounts such an event. The Jordan River was miraculously stopped. And it seems likely, according to work by Colin Humphreys and others, that this was due to a landslide which was upstream. So this was, in some sense, a natural process, a contingent process, but in its specific context, it pointed clearly to the action of God in the world. So chance-like natural processes can be pointers to God's action within the world. Maybe that's controversial, but we can go further and say even necessary processes or law-like processes can also be pointers to God's action in the world. An example of this is what's called the nebula hypothesis, the idea that things like the solar system arose ultimately out of a mix of gas which wasn't particularly structured, as we see in step 1, step 2, due to various forces, the gas is spiraling and accumulating into objects, until eventually through this process, which we can explain in purely law-like terms through the law of gravity, we end up with something like the solar system. So this is the mainstream account of how things like the solar system come into being, and it was being developed in the late 1700s. And initially when it was developed, it was seen as a challenge to God's creative action. How could this necessary process, which doesn't appeal to God's creation, be something which God used? And the Christian philosopher, theologian, scientist William Whewell discussed this and pointed out this is not necessarily the case. You don't have to see this as atheistic. God can use these laws to achieve his creative purposes. And nowadays, this is not really controversial in the way that, say, evolution is a bit more controversial for Christians. Most Christians don't have a problem with things like the solar system forming through law-like processes. And that's because we recognize God can use natural law to create, at least in space. We can go a little further than this today as well, because it's not just that any old laws will form the solar system. Actually, we need fine-tuning in those laws. It's only a particular subset of laws that will create something like the solar system. So some kind of fine-tuning is required for a life-friendly solar system. So just because something arose through law-like processes or natural necessity doesn't mean that God wasn't involved. And if these processes require fine-tuning, then these processes can actually point in quite a strong way to God's involvement in creation. So this is true for both the chance-like processes and the law-like processes. And now I want to apply this to evolution. Why does evolution work so well? You might think, well, evolution doesn't work that well, and we can discuss that, but at least in some cases, evolution works really well. One example at the top, the human eye can detect, under certain conditions, can detect a single photon of light. So that's the maximal possible resolution, or as far as you can go in terms of optimality in detecting light. The human eye can detect a single photon. The bacterial flagellum, another amazing construction in the natural world. Some versions of the flagellum can spin at 100,000 revolutions per minute. So it's an amazingly sophisticated molecular machine. evolution can work remarkably well. The human brain can store, I believe, terabytes of data, depending on how you calculate it. So the human brain is optimized in all kinds of interesting ways as well. So biology is full of these phenomena, which most people recognize are amazing feats of optimality. Evolution can do really well. But why does evolution work so well? A quick caveat to mention, as some people might think of this, of course, not everything evolution produces is good. Evolution is not all beautiful. We've seen that with SARS-CoV-2, a result of evolution which was harmful. And I think it would be a mistake, of course, to ignore this. But I think it's also a mistake to focus on this, to only see evolution as full of these things. Unfortunately, or fortunately perhaps, that's a separate project, delving into the theodicy of why the world is this way. And I want to, for today's talk, just focus on the question of why does evolution do so well, insofar as it does do some things very well. Many people assume, well, evolution just has to work. It's just the way it is. Once you have evolution, you get these amazing things. An example of this is Professor Susan Blackmore, who says, it's this inevitability that I find so delightful. The evolutionary algorithm just must produce design. And once you understand that, you have no need to believe or not believe in evolution. You see how it works. So the idea there is once you have an evolutionary algorithm, you have mutation plus selection, you inevitably resolve in these kinds of interesting forms of complexity. And in saying this, she's very much picking up on the work of people like Daniel Dennett, who's picking up very much on the work of Richard Dawkins. So they see evolution as this algorithmic process, and once you have the algorithm, you automatically get these interesting results. And I want to push back against this a little bit in a couple of ways. Again, coming back to this dichotomy between chance and law. So the first is interesting chance-like events in evolution. So it's not just that evolution has to work, it inevitably works, because a lot of things that happen in evolution seem to have been incredibly improbable. They seem to have been incredibly fortuitous, would be another way to put it. Lots of examples of this, but one of them is eukaryogenesis, the origin of eukaryotes. There's different models for this available. I'm not an expert in this area, but whichever model you go with, it seems to have required an improbable series of events. And this is relatively widely accepted, I think, in the field of evolutionary biology. The eukaryotic cell, the complex cells we find in animals and plants and fungi, have all kinds of complex features which aren't found in bacterial or archaeal cells, the simpler single-celled organisms. And there's various models where archaea and bacteria combined under certain conditions to create the modern eukaryotic cell. Whichever model you go with, it's a complex, improbable, in some sense, event, which is why it's thought that it probably didn't happen very many times. So there's all kinds of events within evolution that seem unlikely. We couldn't have predicted them. If we have a phrase that's used as if we rewound the tape of life, would we get the same thing? With eukaryogenesis, it's hard to argue that we would. And there's many other examples, I think. So evolution doesn't just have to happen. It doesn't have to end in something or create something like humans or complex animal life, because many steps along the way, in hindsight, seem to have been quite improbable. This isn't to say that they didn't happen or to make an argument from God of the gaps. It's just to say that evolution requires a lot of fortuitousness or chance. So it's not just deterministic. It's not just something that had to happen. This is discussed to some extent in a recent paper by David Glass, who I mentioned before, which is published in Zygon, and I'll come back to that soon. What about the order aspect of evolution? Does this help us think about the question of whether the evolution just had to happen? I think it does. One thing we can think about here is what's called fitness landscapes, which is illustrated in this nice diagram here. The point being that it's the terrain of possible results of different genetic sequences. Some sequences produce highly functional, optimized molecules or organisms. And some features, if you mutate them enough in particular ways, you end up with non-functional things. So that in this kind of illustration, the functional regions are like the mountain peaks, and the non-functional regions are the plains or the valleys. In any evolutionary search, whether in biology or in computer science, and is probably people here who know a lot more about this than I do, is comprised of an evolutionary landscape or an evolutionary problem, plus an algorithm which traverses the landscape. And there's a recent paper by Oxford computer scientist and Christian Professor Peter Jevons who explores this and says it's becoming clear that there is no universal acid. To achieve significant results, an evolutionary algorithm must be carefully tailored to the problem in hand, and the problem itself must have appropriate properties. So he gets this by summing up his experience in the computer science literature and applies this to the problem of evolutionary search in biology as well. So this is in another paper in this recent edition of Zygon, The Design of Evolutionary Algorithms, a computer science perspective on the compatibility of evolution and design. So the idea here is that in order for evolution or something like an evolutionary process to be so successful, it seems like it needs to be set up in a fairly specific way. This is controversial, but I think really well evidenced actually from different angles within the theoretical biology literature and computer science, and very happy if people would like to talk more about this. So this was just a really quick illustration of chance and necessity, or creativity and order within evolution, with a couple of examples. These things and related issues are explored in this recent book by my friend Roope Kujonen, who's a Finnish philosopher and theologian who's working in this area. The idea that evolution and an inference to design are actually compatible, you can have both, was proposed a long time ago by Asa Gray, who is a distinguished botanist and friend of Darwin, and I think it's worth reviving, and a number of people are exploring this today. Myself and Dr. Kujonen edited this collection of papers, including these ones that I mentioned. So if you're interested in this area of how could evolution really be compatible with an inference to design, then this is a great place to go, either the book or the collection of papers that we recently edited. So in summary, the successes of evolution are typically either denied, evolution doesn't work, or they're just taken for granted. Of course evolution works. Once you have the algorithm, it comes for free. But I would like to argue today that whether from contingent or law-like processes, the success of evolution often appears to have stringent preconditions. It needs to be set up nicely in order for evolution to work. For me, at least, these suggest God's creativity and order within the evolutionary process, and they may even, again controversially, point to what Newton referred to as God's most wise and excellent contrivances of things in this world. So thank you for the opportunity to present to you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We've got time for probably one or two questions in the room and maybe some from Zoom. We'll see what we get. So I'm going to come to you if that's all right.
Thank you very much, Zachary. Very interesting. I wonder what you think about the possibility that chance alone is sufficient to make a design inference. So, to illustrate what I mean by that, I think most Christians would have no problem with thinking that someone called by God, a person who's famous like Moses or Abraham, was the product of a chance meeting of a sperm and an egg, possibly a very chance meeting of the mother and the father in some social environment, and so on back in time. So, do we really need to look for order? Is chance enough to be able to have no problem with God being completely in control and the designer of everything?
Yeah, so this idea is explored in this paper by David Glass that I mentioned, that you can also make a design inference from chance. So people have tended to emphasize the orderliness of evolution, but I think that the chance can also, but it's a little bit difficult, so you need to be careful about what kinds of chance are really compatible with a design inference. And I think it's chance producing a particular outcome which is a special outcome in some way. And so this kind of thing is discussed in the literature on fine-tuning and cosmology, that a life-permitting universe isn't particularly favored within naturalism. Naturalism doesn't care about whether the universe permits life or not, but God would conceivably care whether the universe permits life or not. So it's not just that chance by itself is enough, but chance plus an interesting outcome favors God over naturalism.
Okay, so there's a question online. Apologise, I don't know how to say the word, but it says, does the concept of entelechy sum up what Dr. Ardern is saying?
Maybe, I'm not sure. So there's all kinds of related concepts around teleology and goal-directedness and teleonomy and entelechy, and I actually don't know. People use these words differently, so I would just say maybe, and I think all these concepts are related. But what I'm most interested in is when can we legitimately infer these things? I don't just want to, I think it's true that God is creator, and we can say this regardless, but I'm also interested in, can we make a case for this? And I think this has been sadly neglected and is worth exploring more.
Okay, we've got time for one more.
I think I once took upon myself to read Dawkins' Ancestor's Tale, which is a huge, great big tome. Must have taken me 3 months. And you'll see in the very last page that the whole of the book's around evolution, the different gateways. So he talks about sexual selection, all the different gateways, and his last page, actually, he says he's actually amazed. He says it's staggering improbability of life happening. And the only reason he gives for not belief in God is because he finds religion limiting. So, I mean, have you read that, and do you agree with Dawkins?
So I haven't read much of Dawkins other than The God Delusion, unfortunately. I have a number of his books on my shelf. He's an influential popularizer of science, let's say that. I think there's a lot there that these things are improbable. And even, so he'll tend to ascribe most of this to natural selection and think that that's enough to explain it. But what I'm trying to very briefly hint at with the fitness landscape stuff is that if you explain something in terms of natural selection, that's not necessarily the end of the story, because you still need to ask why that particular fitness landscape. So it's really always just pushing it back a level, unless you ultimately just go to pure contingency, pure chance. And this is what the naturalist always has to go to. From ancient Greece through to today, naturalists have always said ultimately it's just chance, or it's just the way it had to be. That's all the naturalist can say. And I think the more we see various interesting features of life in the universe, we can say it doesn't look like it's just chance, and it doesn't look like it's the way it had to be, so maybe there is an alternative of God's creative purpose.
Amazing, thank you so much. There's going to be more opportunity to ask Zach some questions later in the panel.